definitely a bad bearing. Hi everyone, and welcome to Drive, your source for automotive reviews, analysis, maintenance, and restorations. Please subscribe to our channel, watch the entire video, watch our other videos, and of course click on notifications to be first to learn about new videos. I'm Chris Capredoni, and in this how-to video, I'm going to explain and demonstrate how to replace a rear wheel bearing on a BMW X5. This requires pulling the old bearing off of the hub and pressing on a new bearing assembly. No expensive tools are really required, and actually one tool I made myself, and I'll share how it's made and what it's used for. When you start hearing grinding, squealing, or vibrations at a wheel, it most likely is the bearings beginning to deteriorate, or they're well on the path to failure and seizing, which will create a very dangerous driving situation. Let's get over to the BMW and get started. Hi everyone, it's time for me to replace the rear wheel bearings on this 2013 BMW X5 E70. By the way, they're the original ones. And the reason I know that it's time to replace them is because I'm starting to hear low-end squealing coming from both of them. And this one here also has some lateral play. The best way to test that is to lift up one of the suspect wheels, grab it at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, and see if you have any sort of light play or even heavy play. That's an indicator that the bearing assembly is breaking down and immediately needs to be replaced. So I've already done the driver's side. I'm going to be doing this side, and I've already prepped. I've lifted up the vehicle and secured it in 3 spots. I've removed the rotor. There's a little retaining bolt here. I think it's a 5mm that you need to remove in order to lift it off. The caliper has the 2 Torx bolts. I think this is the E19. The top one is very easy to remove. You just go from behind. But the bottom one, it's not a clear line of sight. It's on a little bit on an angle. So you need to get under the vehicle and use a wobbly extension, and then put the socket on, pass it through the suspension components to get to the bolt. Then you can undo it. So it'll be very difficult if you don't have a wobbly extension. So if you don't have one, go and invest in one. There'll be many times that you'll use it. Now I'm ready to do the first step, which is to remove the spindle nut. And what I need to do to remove it is, it's crimped in 2 areas for safety. I need to undo those 2 crimpings using a hammer and a screwdriver, and then I can remove the spindle nut. The spindle nut, there are 2 ways to remove it. You can use a pneumatic air gun, which I've never been a real big fan of, but I'll show it. Also, another way is to use a breaker bar and an extension bar to apply leverage. And by the way, that will be the only way that I do tighten it down, because I don't trust pneumatic guns to do the job the way I want to do it. Also, make sure you make a visual indicator of where it's sitting with respect to the axle. I can see this is about 2mm in, so you'll want to make sure that when you reinstall it, that you're at least in the same spot to make sure that the hub is securely fastened to the axle. Otherwise, you're going to get play. So the next step is for me to get ready to get the tools I need to uncrimp the spindle nut and then remove it. Then the next step will be for me to actually break the hub away from the assembly. Okay, I opened up the little crimps on the axle spindle, so now I'm ready to use my impact gun, which is an air gun, to try and remove this spindle nut. That's been there since it's come out of the factory, so I'm anticipating a lot of work to get this out. So let's get started on this. So what I did to loosen it was I started with the gun, and it was taking quite a while, 5 minutes of it trying, but it must have loosened it and vibrated it loose a little bit for me to go in with my extended bar and break it free. So now I'm just going to go through the process of taking it fully out. Now with the spindle nut removed, the next step is for me to pound the axle back towards the center of the vehicle so that I'll be able to remove the hub assembly much easier. So what I do is I'll start with a small sledgehammer, and then I'm going to use a directed extension so that I can pound it through. There we go. The next step now is for me to use a slide hammer, attach it to the hub, and remove it so that I can move the axle around a bit so that I can gain access to the 4 Torx bolts that's holding the old assembly in place. I've just attached the sliding hammer hub attachment to my hub. What it requires is 3 lug bolts. So you just arrange it and you put them in pretty much hand tight. Then the next step is to actually screw in the assembly for the slide arm, which threads into there. And then what it is, it's a process of pulling it and sliding it back, creating a reverse hammering effect in order to break this free, which will open up the hub assembly. So I'm going to get that set up and then we'll start pulling. Okay, I have my slide hammer all set up and I'm ready to start pulling to separate it. I'm going to be putting on my ear protection because this makes a lot of noise. And I'll also be wearing gloves with a thicker palm because it creates a lot of vibration too. So let's get started. Now I have the outer part of the hub assembly, the bearing assembly removed. You can see the internal bearings. I'm inspecting it and I see that the grease in there is starting to turn dry and gummy. And I saw a few metal specks in there, which tells me that one of those bearings was starting to break down. So it's definitely time to replace it. The next step now, in the order that I do it, is I need to remove the 4 bolts, the Torx bolts that's holding the remainder of this assembly in place. And you can see the bolt here. There's one there, and then 2 below as well. And they have to be removed from the inside. Now, the two top ones aren't too bad. You just kind of have to fish in your ratchet in there to get them. The two bottom ones requires a little bit more dexterity and flexibility. You have to kind of work around that big aluminum swing arm. I've seen videos, and I've actually done it myself, where I've actually removed the swing arm. But what that requires is that you need to readjust the camber. And I'm going to show a video on how to do that. But this time I'm going to make an attempt to remove these probably rusted in bolts without removing any sort of suspension components, because then it takes a lot longer to do. So I'm going to get the tools I need, set up the camera, and then I'll demonstrate what needs to be done. It took a while, but I managed to get all four of the retaining bolts from the back removed. It's a struggle. I mean, you have to go in a number of different angles, use a number of different extensions. One note, one of them, they're supposed to be all E14 Torx. One of them, and it took me a while to figure out, was an E16. I guess at the factory they put a larger one in, but I thought the head was deformed because I couldn't get the socket to fit on. And then I thought for a second, let's just try and put the larger size up, and it fit. So I was able to get it out. Now you can see it's loose, and I have to kind of wiggle this out. I'm going to have to remove part of the parking brake assembly to install the new one, but I can get away with not having to do it now with the old one if I'm careful. There we go. So that's the old one. It's in very bad shape. So the next step now is for me to go to the hub that I pulled off, remove the race ring, and demonstrate how to install a new hub assembly onto our new bearing assembly onto the hub with a little method that I rigged up myself. In front of me, I have the hub that I pulled off, and this is the part of the bearing assembly that stays on the hub when you pull it off when I used my slide hammer. So that has to be removed. This ring was up above, which I smacked out using a chisel and a hammer, going around and getting it out. But I will not be as lucky to use the same method to get this out. So the way that I haven't done many of these. This is my sixth bearing assembly installation. And the way that I have found that I know others use as well is to use an angle grinder and to actually cut into it until you get to a depth where you can actually go back and use the chisel and smack it where you have cut and crack it open, and then you can slide it off. So I'm going to be demonstrating that too. Okay, I'm ready. The first thing I'm going to do is put proper ear protection on because this machine is loud. Okay, I don't know if it's ready, but let's give it a shot. There we go. Okay, so that's removed. Now you'll notice that when I was grinding, I did make a small indentation. That will have no effect in installing the new bearing assembly. So don't be worried about little marks like that. I mean, it's a surface one. It will not affect the friction fit or anything like that. So that's the best way, you know, for a home mechanic to try and remove something like this. You could heat it up, but you need something pretty powerful, and then you're gonna heat this up as well, and they most likely will expand at the same rate, and you'll still be in the same place and working with a very hot piece of metal. I find this to be safest, and it only took 5 minutes. Original hub here is all prepped and ready to go. If you have a damaged hub, you can obviously replace that too, but this one's in very good shape, so I'm going to reuse it. Here is the new bearing assembly, and the way it goes on is it goes on like this, where you have the bolt holes going to the outside, which will bolt to the suspension and the knuckle. So what I need to do is press it in, but I don't have a press. So what I did over here was I rigged up a little system of just regular hardware parts. So I've got a large threaded bolt or nut without the heads, 2 washers, and 2 large nuts, and then a steel plate where I drilled a hole in. And what that'll do is I hold down on this side, and then I compress slowly until this part of the bearing assembly is mated with the backside of the hub plate. So I'm going to set it up, and then I'll start doing it. I don't have a proper wrench system, so I'm using a vice grip on this side, which I'll hold down, and then I've got, this is my largest adjustable wrench, and then what I've done is I've gotten a handle and I've attached it to it, and that's how I'm using all the leverage that I need in order to compress it, because if you were to just use the wrench itself, you wouldn't be able to do it. I don't have a proper bench as well, so I have to do it on a concrete floor, but let me get it all set up and then I'll demonstrate what I do. I've been successful with this method for many times. So I've assembled my DIY press on the bearing and the hub. I've lined it up. It seems to be okay. So what's required of me now is to hold my foot down on this vice grip and then use this wrench with the handle and start slowly compressing. I don't want to rush it. You don't want to rush it because we want to make sure that it's going to mate perpendicular, horizontally with the you want it to line up properly. That's basically what I'm saying. You don't want it to start going in on an angle, because then it'll be very difficult to remove and you might actually damage it. So here I'm ready. I think I'm ready to get going. So slow and little movements. So far, it's not that difficult, but it will get more difficult. Keep an eye on your visually with your spacing to make sure that it's still mating properly, because now would be the time to make an adjustment. Okay, I think I'm done. You can see here, they've mated together. So the next thing I need to do is remove my press and then start installing this whole assembly back onto the vehicle. Here we are back at the wheel. And in order to fit if you recall, when I was able to take out the old bearing assembly, I was able to jiggle it out. That's because the axle was floating around on the inside. Now I have to actually fit it directly onto the axle splines. So I need to be able to line that up and line up the holes. Given the fact that the parking brake shoes are in the way, I need to partially remove them. Some people remove them totally, but then it's a real pain in the butt to readjust the expanding lock. So what I do is I took the spring off of the side with the adjusting bolt, pull it apart, take the adjusting bolt out, and then where's my use my 5mm Allen, disengage the two shoes, and then what you'll be able to do is kind of just swing it aside, just enough for you to do your work. And that way you won't be fooling around with the expanding lock, trying to reset it with the parking brake cable. So here is the new assembly. I need to be able to fit it on the spline and line it up with the holes. So this is what I do. It's not an exact science, but you'll know it's going on the splines quite nicely. And then I'll be able to tap the axle so that it'll come out just enough so that I can start the threads on the spindle lock. So let me get my bolts, and then we'll continue on lining up and start re-putting in the bolts with thread lock this time. Okay, I got one of my bolts. This happens to be the E16 one, the one that's not supposed to actually be on the vehicle. So I'm going to install that in the top right hand corner. Here's my thread lock. Just going to put a little bit, nothing drastic, and feed it through the hole. Okay, there it is. And then line up the hub so that I can start screwing it in place. I managed to secure all 4 bolts. What I did was I hand fed them all in and didn't tighten them so that I could have wiggle room for each and every one, which I needed in order to get the thread started. I put thread lock on all of them, and then all of them I tightened from the backside. It was easier for me to get under the car, use my expanders and wobbly extensions to tighten them up. So they're all tightened, they're all good to go. The next step now is for me to reassemble the parking brake. And then the last step is for me to install the spindle nut and tighten it down to the point where it originally was. It was about 2 millimeters past the surface of the axle. So the next step for me to do is to start putting this back together. So expand it around the hub again, put it back in place. Put the nut back in place. This is probably a good opportunity for me to clean it. But not break it. The next thing would be for me to install the spring pins, one there and one there. which I'm not very good at. It takes usually 3 or 4 or 10 times to get them in place, and then to install the one spring that I did remove. And my recommendations is to hook it on the bottom, hold it with pliers, and use the hub surface, the bearing assembly, as leverage to pull it up into place. But let me start with by installing the pins. There you go. Okay, so the next step now for me is to install the spindle nut and start torquing it down so that I can get it back to the original setting by pulling that axle and the hub together tight. Okay, can't get it to go anymore. Visually, it looks the same as it was when I originally had it on. All I need to do now is crimp at least one side. I'll do both, and then it's a matter of putting back the rotor, the caliper, the wheel, and testing it out. Thanks everyone for watching this informative DIY tutorial on how to replace rear wheel bearings on a BMW X5. This procedure is a bit more complicated than most DIY replacements, but with a little time and effort, you will be able to install them and forget about them for approximately 5 to 10 years. Please ensure to wear proper eye, ear, and hand protection, and properly lift and secure the vehicle with jack stands and wheel chocks. Ensure that you reinstall the wheel lug bolts to the proper torque. Replace any damaged bolts as necessary. This X5 requires a torque spec of 105 pound-feet. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and select the notification option. Drive, your source for automotive reviews, analysis, maintenance, and restorations.